We have our third Conservative Party leader in 7 weeks, who will be the fifth Prime Minister in just 6 years of the UK, Rishi Sunak. Now, Rachel, you're speaking to us from a sort of oak-panelled room in Parliament, the only quiet room you could find, but you've just been outside the speech he made to Tory MPs in a private room in Parliament after winning. What was the mood like? What were people saying as they were going in and out?
Given the vast majority of MPs kind of got behind Rishi Sunak, it was kind of, they were wanting to make the maximum projection of being just incredibly united, and that this is a very settled decision, and that this is a party that is not at war with itself. It's kind of trying to put division behind it. So Penny Mordaunt came in earlier. So this was a meeting of Conservative Party MPs in one of the committee rooms. Penny Mordaunt entered before him, got a really big cheer from everybody, you know, so kind of to the point where they're banging on the desks purposely so people outside can hear. And then Rishi Sunak comes in sort of a few minutes later, similarly gets a very, very, very big round of applause, lots of banging on desks. And we had some MPs briefing us afterwards, kind of just, you know, I think for the first 10 MPs that came out, we were asking, oh, what was the mood? What was the mood? And it was just good, very good, good. and what did he say? It was very disciplined. You know, I think this is a party that's very aware of just how damaging this period has been for them as an electoral force, really. And the job they have on their hands trying to close that poll gap with Labour now. You talked about some of those difficult, you know, it's a terrible phrase, really, difficult choices coming for that spending review next week. And he also talked a little bit about the Labour Party and how they may seem very unthreatening at the moment, but that's certainly not how the party should view them.
Well, it's interesting that MPs who are coming out were trying to show a sort of facade of unity, because it's been after a weekend of chaos, or at least sort of maximum threat, because there was this seemingly genuine idea that Boris Johnson could actually come back, and his supporters were trying to build momentum for that potential eventuality by saying that he had the required 100 nominations. In the end, he bottled it, and it doesn't seem like the numbers or the enthusiasm was there, but you know, you could tell that prospect was really exposing the divisions and anger that have been in the party since he sort of messed up his administration.
Yes, absolutely. I think it was, you know, it was extraordinary just watching it all unfold at the weekend, looking at WhatsApps from people, looking at some of the tweets that were landing, some of the briefings that were coming out. You know, it felt like they'd rewound back to sort of May, June, July, when everyone was trying to tear Boris Johnson down, and they were going into their camps and just really kind of doing themselves so much damage. But then it just seemed, as the weekend kind of wore on, that you had, you know, MP after MP from all different wings of the party start to really get behind Rishi Sunak. So you had sort of, you know, everyone from Steve Baker and Simon Hoare, who's, you know, from the One Nation Conservative group, and obviously Steve Baker, you know, Brexit hard man, as I think Emmanuel Macron once called him, kind of uniting for this one op-ed together. Then you saw people like, you know, Suella Braverman and Kevin Badenoch also get behind Rishi Sunak, and it just slowly became very, very obvious that nobody else was going to kind of get enough support to mount any kind of challenge, really. And I think I'm always impressed by just how quickly and how completely the Conservative Party can unite. You know, it certainly wouldn't be the case if it was the Labour Party. This would have torn them apart for 2 years minimum.
Yeah, well, you kind of saw that with Liz Truss as well in the last leadership election, where when it looked like the momentum was on her side, suddenly you had all of these MPs who had supported Rishi Sunak and other candidates throwing their endorsements in behind her. Ben, what impact does this have potentially on the Conservatives in the polls? Because one of the arguments for bringing Boris Johnson back was that he had won the election in 2019. That meant that he had perhaps more of a mandate with the public than perhaps Rishi Sunak would have. But also, you know, every Tory MP has their eye on this terrible polling that the party's had since Liz Truss entered Downing Street, really. Is Rishi Sunak sort of better for them in terms of public opinion, or would a return of Boris Johnson have worked better?
Oh, well, we are, 3-4 months on from the last leadership election, and you would be tempted to think things have changed, but in a way they have. We have more scandals. The Labour lead is at 20, 30, 40 points, depending on which poll you look at. But the thing that has been consistent is, of course, the parliamentary party, at least, probably splitting for Rishi Sunak. He is perhaps the only known face, I suppose, amongst voters, or the predominantly known face. Penny Mordaunt had some recognition. Johnson, yeah, he had it, but it was overwhelmingly negative. The thing with Sunak is his reputation wasn't built up like Johnson's was on scandal after scandal after scandal. Rishi Sunak ruined his reputation when he bungled the initial response to the cost of living crisis in his spring statement all that long ago. He was the one that started or kind of dragged the Tory lead on the economy down to the ground. And when he left, already Labour had a lead then. So he is part of the reason why the Conservatives are in the doldrums right now. But there are some positives for him. You know, we are at rock bottom. That's not us editorializing. That's not us being dramatic. You know, that we are at rock bottom with the Conservative polling numbers right now. That is Liz Truss here. So for anyone else to come about is, to be honest, a net benefit for you. You may have noticed the Mordaunt campaign, the unofficial briefed Johnson campaign, if there was one, and of course Sunak. They were all briefing different kinds of polling over the course of the weekend and on Friday. There was a poll for every one of them. You know, whoever became Prime Minister would have done better than Liz Truss, because Liz Truss is at rock bottom. Liz Truss is perhaps the most unpopular Premier we've seen for quite some time. So anyone is a net benefit, really. So right. Here is a little prediction that I'm quite confident of. At the moment, Labour leads the polls by about 25 to 30 percentage points, depending on which pollster you look at. By virtue of not being Liz Truss, you're going to see that lead fall, that Labour lead go down. Of course, you're going to see the Tory base rally. Here in Chester, I know the Conservative Association was absolutely shocked and almost they didn't have a positive view about Liz Truss, and they're very much pro Sunak backers, and they will be much prouder about that in the by-election going forward. You know that there's a Tory brand they can argue for now. There's a Tory brand they can push towards voters on the doorstep. And what that means is Tory voters now feel like, oh, I can come out the woodwork and say I'm going to vote Conservative. It's going to push up the Tory poll numbers. Will it give us a Tory lead? Probably not. Unlikely. Will it save the Conservatives from an inevitable defeat? I do not think so. If you go all the way back to 1945, and you look at the polling back then, because there was some hard to get online, but they do exist in these really heavy, thick tomes behind me here. If you look at them and you see how getting to minus 25, getting to minus 30 in the polls, you never recover from that. You know, you never, not once has a party, a government that has fallen 30 points behind the opposition, that has fallen 25 points behind the opposition. Not once have they ever come back to win at the next election. So really, if you want to go for probabilities, if you want to go for maths, really, you could put the probability of the Tories winning the next election now at close to zero. It's between 5% and 0%. Of course, don't rule a 1 in 20 chance out, but goodness me, it really is. It's terminal. The best hope for the Conservatives now under Rishi Sunak is turning that 30-point route to maybe a 20 or 15 or 10-point route. They could reduce their losses to perhaps, they could stay above 200 seats in Parliament. That's the best, I think, initially at least, we're going to get with Rishi Sunak.
Right, okay. But people are a bit more tribal, aren't they, now? I mean, you've written yourself, Ben, that we're a nation of swingers. So, it's important that Labour isn't complacent about this.
I think this will be a period in which sort of the theatre of Parliament will be back, because I could see, this is the most united that the Conservative Party MPs have been for a very long time. They certainly weren't united under Liz Truss, because the vast majority of them didn't back her. Similarly with Boris Johnson, for quite a long time after COVID, he was quite a divisive figure. It was, they were very chaotic and disparate bunch, really. Whereas I think you're going to see a much more disciplined government in terms of just what you'll see as the Commons. And I think that's kind of, you can kind of say a similar thing for the Labour Party. When you just think back to their conference, that seemed like the most united, most disciplined you'd ever seen the Labour Party either. So I think, the parliamentary games, PMQs, all of the kind of big sessions that you see in Parliament are going to kind of be really watchable and really quite dramatic, I think, in the months ahead.
Yeah, and while we, all of us, of course, enjoy the drama, one of the issues, I think, with what's happened to the Conservative Party lately is that the public feel completely disconnected from it. So we haven't had any statements or interviews or even policy announcements from Rishi Sunak this time round. And that's the point you made in Morning Call this morning, Rachel, that public is, it hasn't had, any scrutiny of the kind of policies that Rishi Sunak's going to introduce. So we don't know whether he's going to put national insurance back up. That was his policy. That's been scrapped. Whether he's going to raise universal credit in line with inflation, whether he's going to change the energy support plan again, because his policy over the summer was to scrap VAT on domestic energy bills. I mean, will there be a return to austerity? The indications suggest so. He said he'd take a tough stance on public sector pay, but that was over summer. A lot has changed since then. So it's difficult for the public to know what they're getting. And actually, when Liz Truss resigned, I was out reporting in Middlesbrough, and this is a town in the northeast that you might count as a sort of red wall constituency that's still in Labour hands, but trending Conservative perhaps over the last few general elections. And the feeling there was one of relief when Liz Truss had announced that she was going, but also complete bafflement that they didn't get a say on who comes next. Now, we all know that's not how the system works, but that doesn't stop there being a lot of frustration among the general public. And, I was speaking to people there. One man who was a retired postman in his 60s who'd never voted Labour in his life before was telling me it should be the public who get to choose the Prime Minister, not the Conservative Party. And he really felt that the Conservative Party had messed things up and was furious. So I know Labour are sort of leaning into this enthusiasm for a general election, but I think, it is a fair stance to take in terms of the frustration that I feel from my reporting is out there. I mean, Ben, is there any indication in the polls of the appetite for a general election?
Oh, 100%. You have some polls as high as 60, 70 something percent saying they want a general election soon. The past 4 months has instilled a feeling of chaos amongst voters. And if you ask people who've recently stopped voting Conservative, what is the primary reason? To be honest, recently it's not the cost of living crisis, it's not the economy, it's actually just the political chaos in Westminster. It really has this drama story, which we have covered extensively for excellent traffic over at the New Statesman website. It's really irritated voters. So much so that this is what people are annoyed with, and so they want to have a say on it. They want a general election. That's why I'm kind of going back to a point I made previously. That's why I think the arrival of Rishi Sunak may mean some form of calm. Now, of course, there's going to be issues with the potential return of austerity 2.0, no answers to the cost of living, GDP numbers could be bad, but at least, as Rachel said, the Tory parliamentary party is going to rally around him, hopefully, probably. So there's going to be some form of calm. So there's going to be some form of end to the political chaos, which actually may relax enough voters. We should really continue polling on whether there should be a general election in the next few months. Keep asking that after a few months of Sunak. I don't know whether it will stay in majority territory. I think it probably will. This feeling that you haven't had a say will probably persist. But the potential end to the 24/7 coverage of chaos may soften those numbers somewhat, and indeed push up the Tory party's poll ratings as well, just a little bit.
Yeah, and Rachel, just before we move on to the second section, I was just going to ask you, how is Labour feeling about going up against Rishi Sunak? I mean, it's their strategy. It seems to associate him with that chaos of the Johnson age as his right-hand man. But when I'm out and about speaking to people, I often hear his name in association with the pandemic support that he brought in, and that's seen quite favourably by people still.
Yeah, I was just going to make a broader point about sort of that mood for a general election first of all, because I think that Rishi Sunak hasn't helped himself in the last couple of days actually by not making any public statements, by not making I think he put a tweet out and then he's just then people watched him walk out of his house on a Sky News camera or a BBC camera, not making any speeches. And now his first speech as Prime Minister, as he's just been elected, was behind closed doors to the group of Conservative Party MPs who've just given him his new and most powerful job in the country. And I would also say, in addition to all that, how they can avoid calls for a general election is they're going to have to stick hard and fast to talking about the 2019 Conservative Party manifesto. And I think if they start to just make it start to drift away from that, drift away from a sense of mission, I think the government, the people in this country will feel like they don't have a grip and are not able to have like a way to start holding the government to account for the things they're doing and for the things that they voted for in the first place. So I think a lot of people have kind of had this view over the last couple of days that, because of the economic crisis, that of course Rishi Sunak doesn't have to talk about the manifesto. I think it's quite the opposite, actually. I think that they will hate calls for a general election if they just kind of ignore everything that came before and assume that they can continue with their mandate. In terms of how Labour's feeling, I think genuinely their preferred outcome would have been Penny Mordaunt, because they just didn't know what they would have been able to throw at her. I think quite a few people have had a dig at her for putting out that tweet about Ed Balls, in which she said that she's a clean piece of paper or whatever, or she's a blank slate, and they're like, why is she saying she's a blank slate? And that's genuinely how Labour sees her. They did think she was a big threat to them, actually. And I think she came from a forces community. That's a lot of the places that they're trying to target. She understands Labour voters in a way that perhaps Rishi Sunak doesn't. I think one of the things that they'll try to rely on with Rishi Sunak is that, he's an incredibly wealthy individual, perhaps somewhat unrelatable for people. The sort of received wisdom on that is that voters quite like people who quite like, leaders who are rich and they don't have a problem with it. But I think there is a level of like rich, there's a millionaire and there's a billionaire. And then there's a billionaire whose billionaire wife rather, who had non-dom status, that kind of just level of feeling removed. I think it's the kind of elitism that turned voters away from the Remain campaign. I think that kind of feeling of just not having much skin in the game. And I just wonder if that might be a problem for Rishi Sunak, and that might be something that Labour seizes on. But I don't think I think out of the two that were left, they're probably happier with Sunak than they would have been with Penny Mordaunt.
Right, that's really interesting, and we'll keep an eye on whether that was the right calculation as Rishi Sunak becomes Prime Minister.